My name is Jared Smith, and today I'd like to talk to you about withdrawing the BGP rerouting curtain. Imagine that you have tickets to the world's most exclusive music festival, one with luxury food, accommodations that are a suit for a king, and all of your favorite concerts. Well, many of you are probably thinking that it would be like this, with the artists there, and Blink-182, Lizzo, Coldplay, whoever it may be. The rest of you are probably thinking something this complex could never happen. And that was true. It was the Fire Festival. Much like the Fire Festival, and as complex as it was, in security we also make a lot of assumptions and claims about systems that are very similarly complex, like the internet. We make claims that a protocol says one thing, so of course something else happens in response to that. We have methodologies that rely on inference and passive measurements. And we make assumptions based on common logic that have not yet been tested in reality, that while they may work out, we're not quite sure. The focus of this study is to examine that juxtaposition specifically in the context of internet routing security. We examine systems that use BGP poisoning, a technique to reroute inbound traffic, and we look at reevaluating a system and providing insights to others that leverage BGP poisoning, but in practice and not based on just simulation and inference and passive measurement as papers have done before. Finally, we examine if the common logic about the internet holds in some of these cases. Before we get into the bulk of the paper, I want to cover a bit about the internet and internet routing security, because not many of us do BGP. There's like 4 of us in the world, so I'd love to kind of fill you in on what it is. So first, the internet isn't really just a big cloud of nothing in it, and it just magically happens. Really, there are these units in the internet that are networks. And in BGP world, we like to talk about these as autonomous systems. These autonomous systems have to have a way of talking to each other and exchanging information that allows them to connect. That's done by a protocol, Border Gateway Protocol. The important thing to note about the Border Gateway Protocol is that it is a path vector routing protocol. And on top of that, it allows certain policies to influence the decisions of where traffic goes. So for example, A propagates a path to itself, or it says, hey, here's how you reach me. And then when it gives it to its next neighbors, those people prepin themselves to the path. They put themselves behind it. So that when D gets it, what happens is it has explicit direct control over how to send its traffic. Here it chose C, so it prepinned itself to the path on C. That allows it, whenever it gets traffic destined for A, to go over the path through C and not B. That is what I mean by policies. The most simple is local preference. In this case, it chose to go over C. Now, there may be cases where we want to control the inbound traffic. There are ways to do that, but they're only hints. Those kinds of things like the multi-exit discriminator, there are other ROCs that are looking at things like communities, but all of these are just hints. They allow you to tell people what you think they should do. However, there is a technique known as BGP poisoning. The thing about it, though, is BGP poisoning relies on protocol-compliant behavior that is a side effect, not a direct mechanism of control, which all of this research is building on top of. What I'm going to get to is telling you that that research has not been actively measured. A bit about BGP poisoning. So just to illustrate that, I told you it lets you control inbound traffic flow. Here we have AS1, and it's the slides were messing up a bit, but basically AS1 gets its traffic from AS3 over AS2. So if AS1 wants to actually go over AS4, what it can do and how BGP poisoning works is you prepend yourself to the path. So when AS1 prepends or when you prepend AS2 to the path, and the loop detection mechanism in BGP, a part of the protocol, says that when you receive a path, if you are on that path, you should drop it. You should drop it. Note the word should. So in this case, when AS2 receives a path from AS1 and it's already on there, it will drop it, and now AS3 only has a path over AS4. See here. So when that happens, we are able to control the inbound traffic if that AS2 is going to listen to our loop detection and actually match the protocol. This is used in a number of security systems, one of which is our own. So this is NIX. NIX is a way of mitigating DDoS traffic by routing around congestion. How do we do that? Well, we reroute around the congestion using BGP poisoning. So note there's this alternate path here. We can recognize that exists and reroute around it, thus propagating or pushing our traffic around the congestion. This is our work from IEEE S&P 2018. Yet it was only tested in simulation. I was one of those people. I started this talk off by saying, hey, we want to do these things in practice. Why don't we? Well, we started by not doing that. And it turns out it doesn't just work that way in practice. Unfortunately, a lot of other systems rely on the same mechanism. So everything from censorship circumvention to studies looking at the feasibility of our prior system NICs, all the way to measurement techniques. Yet there are diverging claims when it comes to this research. NICs, on one hand, claims that you can mitigate DDoS by using BGP poisoning to route around congestion. Yet other systems like Waterfall of Liberty from CCS at the time explicitly assumed inbound traffic rerouting was challenging. These two systems, while both published, are built on polar opposite assumptions, but neither are tested in the live internet. And all of those prior systems before make decisions about how they structure their designs and how they solve their problems based on these assumptions. But in reality, problems can occur. For example, an AS might realize it's not actually on the path. You prepend yourself to that path, and when another AS gets it that you're intending to have them drop it, they say, that doesn't look right. I'm just not going to do that. I'm going to use my old best path. Remember, it's about policies. You want to influence their best path to you. They might realize we're lying about the path, or they could think it's anomalous. A good example of this is if we are UT and we prepend AT&T, that would imply that we transit traffic for AT&T. Our small university does not provide traffic for one of the largest networks on the internet. So if someone sees that, they could rightfully drop it. In making assumptions about these systems based on those types of behaviors that may pan out in practice is extremely dangerous. And that is what this paper goes about trying to examine. How do we do that? Well, it turns out you can actively measure these systems in the live internet. It wasn't done before, and it takes a lot of infrastructure, but it is possible. So how might we do that? Well, how might we do that? It involves a few things. First, it involves a mechanism to send BGP announcements. Real, live, non-fake BGP announcements. These announcements then get propagated throughout the internet, and we collect the explicit information that tells us where they're going, who's filtering them, who's dropping them. Finally, we want a mechanism to send traffic along those new paths. We want to advertise BGP and put out entirely new paths that didn't exist before, as if the internet just started or as the internet's just a clean slate for us to test on, and then measure how our traffic comes back. And I'll show you in a bit, we can introduce poisoning to this, and boom, we have a whole system to measure BGP poisoning in practice. So I mentioned BGP. We use the peering testbed, which I'll talk about in a second, as well as a university. And it's really simple. You send an API request, and it propagates, and boom, you have a bunch of BGP announcements out there. In reality, that took us like 6 months to get to that point with all the other infrastructure, so it's not that simple, but I have some good news coming for you in a second. The second piece is that we can measure the updates from these. So when these propagate throughout the internet, we want to see explicitly where they're going and who's accepting them, who's propagating them. Fortunately, Kaida, just down the street, really made this job easier for us. There's a library out maybe since 2017, I believe, from Alistair King, that does collecting BGP updates through a very clean API, and you can get it back in Python or C. So that gives us that component. Finally, what we want is a mechanism to see with those announcements what path our traffic takes. And a lot of us used to rely on Planet Lab. I found Planet Lab to be a little less reliable recently, so we worked on WriteThatList, which fortunately has even more measurement points, and it's open source. You don't even have to host a node. With WriteThatList, you send an API request, and it tells you what path that traffic took back to you. So we are announcing BGP, sending a packet to, or sending an API request to WriteThatList, and then seeing which path that traffic takes. All the while collecting the updates to tell us whether what we're seeing is actually happening, and to look at properties of those paths and how they're propagating. All of this infrastructure is open. It's across multiple countries, many points of presence, thousands of upstream peers, 5,000 distinct vantage points, and all public BGP collectors. You can get a ton of BGP updates from this. While you can get other updates from private sources, just seeing these is enough to cover the vast majority of the internet. Furthermore, all of our software is automated. It's all written in Python, and you can use it. We're not just scripting this away. We are literally integrating this infrastructure into a cohesive framework. And it's all free, like I said. You can use this. Once we finish this conference, I need to do a bit of sanitary cleanup in the code, but you can find it there. All of them are free except for peering, which is free with a caveat that you need to apply, because, as I need to tell you very briefly, turns out when you measure things in the live internet, ethics kind of come into play. So peering has an application. And the reason is because they make you do a few things. And we also worked with our campus operator to do similar things. First and foremost, we announce to and engage with the entire operator community via nanog, email lists, and write before we start any experiments. So if they see a path that's like super long, which is something I'm going to get to, they can email us and say, hey, don't put us on that, don't do that. Throughout the entire 6 months of experiments, we didn't get anyone saying that, but we did that because that's the right thing to do. That's all the peering experiments do that. We don't affect any production traffic. So we are advertising a prefix that only we own. We're only the ones using it. And we send about 1 kilobits per second or less traffic along it. Now, in reality, if Nix was deployed using these insights, Nix would literally be rerouting gigabits of traffic. But we don't need to reroute gigabits of traffic to show that this works. We just need to show that the primitive works itself and show that the side effects don't hamper it. Finally, the last thing I want to point out here is we don't send malformed packets. So some of you in the BGP space may be familiar with past incidents where certain people advertised bad BGP announcements and took down large parts of the internet. Nothing here is malformed. Everything here is sent from actual routers, software routers sending to real router, but from actual routers using real BGP. Now, we did a lot of experiments, and I can't cover all of them, but I want to cover a few of them. First, I really want to cover just the question, does poisoning work? I showed you all of that infrastructure, so let me show you how we do it. It seems really simple, but again, in practice, please use our code because it's a lot more complicated than it seems. And I want to blame myself a little bit for our past paper for not doing it in the real internet because it is a pain. It would have extended that paper by months, and I hope now people can do it a little easier. So if we want to measure this, as I've already showed you, we need to advertise paths. But the first thing we want to do is advertise a poison path. So imagine we poison this particular AS here. When we do that, we can measure the trace route back. Before we poisoned it, we measured the original trace route, so it goes over that link. The definition of BGP poisoning to reroute is that you take an alternate path when you poison an upstream AS. So here, if we send an API request to that WriteThatList probe, the same one as before, and we see it takes a new path, boom, that's a success. That's BGP poisoning. That works. Other cases, like I told you before, where people might drop the path because they think you're lying or they just don't really want to propagate it, you might end up with failures. Here, you end up with a case where the path is still the same. They just didn't really do anything with that loop path you had. Furthermore, there may be cases which somehow some animations mess up a bit here. But anyways, what this is showing is that the alternate path, the one it took, ended before it got to you. So you may lose connectivity in some places. However, these things don't happen that much. They only happen a handful of times. Overall, over 1,400 cases of successful poisoning across the entire internet, 77% of the time. On average, we could discover 6.5 new ASes. So Nix could reroute onto 6.5 new ASes, or 2.25 new paths. This is really important to note, though. 2.25 new paths is not hundreds of new paths like our simulations were showing. Our simulations on the top here, again, sorry about the lines, but anyways, the y-axis is the routing success. That basically says the percentage of cases, like that 1,400 before, that you're able to route onto an alternate path. In simulation, it was over 95% of the time when we're routing around links about 4 to 6 hops outbound. But in the real world, it was markedly less. Not none, it still worked, but less. Because of the ways that theory translates into practice, because protocols like BGP don't exactly pan out when you make assumptions about them. So this leads us to a few things. First of all, real-world evidence does support poisoning. So systems like Nix that rely on side effects of protocol-compliant behavior can work. Security systems need to account for poisoning. There are papers in censorship that make certain assumptions, but now we know that it is a potential issue. And I'll show you in a bit how those systems can still work even with poisoning. Finally, I'm going to keep hammering home that success in simulation does not guarantee success in the real world. We have to stop testing our things in simulation, passively measuring, inferring, or even testing on small test beds, because that's not the live internet. That's not where stuff will actually get deployed. And trust me, it took us 2 years of doing this for me to I'm pretty much brainwashed at this point. I will say it until the end of the day. The other thing we want to look at is common logic. So are alternate routes slower? That might seem intuitive. You would think the paths are ideal for a reason. They're probably slower, right? Or they're, again, non-ideal in other ways. Well, it turns out the alternate paths, this is the distribution of round trip times, it's negligible, very little difference, if any. In fact, some of the alternate paths perform markedly better. This has some stark implications. For example, common logic intuition doesn't always hold. As smart as operators are, they only really know their networks or other networks that they talk to. Finally, this makes it more likely for people using things like poisoning to deploy it. Long paths are something in NICS that I want to discuss briefly, and because this experiment I think is really cool. In NICS, we need to advertise long paths because it uses these to avoid pulling along botnet traffic. So we can do that. We can first advertise a normal path with our own AS and see it propagate throughout the internet. And here we see a baseline of 2 collectors. Those BGP stream collectors get it. So that's 100% collection. Then we can propagate a long path and see, oh look, someone says, the RealWorld earlier steps in and says, that path is way too long, I'm not doing it. So now we end up with 50% of the collectors seeing the path. This pans out as so. So when we advertise paths 250 path lengths long, we literally advertise paths 250 ASes long. We didn't get any emails about it. I'm not sure how, but that is significantly longer than what common BGP statistics say. Podru, for example, said that it's usually no more than the upper 50s when I check it. But that shows that at 5 to 10, about 100% of the same collectors propagated it. But at 250, still 80% of the internet propagated. This has large implications for systems like NICS, where we need that budget. Finally, the last piece I wanted to show you is that it might make sense that people would drop paths that have large ASes on them. So in that case, let me step back for a second. It might make sense that someone would filter an AS that is a large one over a small one. So if I prepend AT&T and I'm UT, someone's going to think that's weird, but they might not think it's weird when we prepend UT Chattanooga, which is the worst school in Tennessee. Never go there. So when we do that, we actually see that for small ASes, it's the same y-axis as before, propagation percentage. Very few are filtered. But the majority of filtering happens at the tier 1s. And in fact, it's crazy. Not even all the tier 1s filter. Some of them don't filter at all. These tier 1 networks don't even filter at all. They won't filter the poisons, which is great for NICS. But as I'm going to talk about, is actually a really cool thing about how poisoning-enabled systems like NICS and Waterfall of Liberty and other systems that implicitly assume it's challenging can work effectively well in practice. So I want to leave you with this. I believe we should publish and disseminate our work only if we measure them at the same environment where we are targeting them for deployment. I think it really shouldn't be a shocking thing, but there's lots of research that does this, including my own. So with that, I just want to leave you with these conclusions, and for the sake of time, I'd love to take questions. Thank you so much.
If you have questions for our speaker, please invite the microphone to the
Great talk. I really enjoyed it. So I think what your paper tells us is that we have bad simulators. So do you think it's possible to use your observations from comparing with real world kind of performance to improve our simulators and perhaps design better simulators, which I assume would allow us to do, I guess, more scalable experiments?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And when I talk about simulation in BGP, the note there is that we rely, and to kind of build on what Amir is saying, is we build on the inferred topology. So the inferred topology has many paths, and in fact, in NICS, we find so many because, of course, it just literally gives us next path. But my suggestion for that is with our simulators, we go in and limit it to the number of paths we found, the path lengths we found, and we put filtering into it. And in fact, in some of our work that we're ongoing right now, we have a journal version of this paper and NICS combined to show it actually works. Not horribly, but it doesn't work as good in practice when you put those limits on it. So I literally have some config options in my simulator for these things now.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
With BGP, one of the things you pointed out with poisoning is that this is not something that's mandated in the standard. We're effectively seeing a side effect. And I'm curious how much of the behavior you saw was how much of it was just different implementations that caused this? So where's the gap between what we expect to happen versus what actually happened?
Yeah. One thing that's really cool in our paper that kind of answers this really well, and he was asking about where's the gap between implementation and the protocol behavior, is that there is a growing group of operators that suggest just totally outlaw poisoning. In fact, there's like 5 references in my paper where it's like nanog operators getting really heated about it. And as the author of NICS, like that really frustrated me at first, but in hindsight, there are a lot of people that use poisoning for bad things. So you can check our paper out. There's a whole piece on looking at consortiums that ask us to do filtering or implicitly filter these things. And where I think it works out to very pointedly answer that is it's not really as much an implementation. Like the loop detection is in there, but they're probably putting policies on top to say, hey, like please, if you prepend your path, I'm just not going to propagate that. And when we talk to some of these people at the tier 1s and them talking about doing something called defensive filtering, they often explicitly say, oh yeah, we will never accept that. So it's honestly more of like I don't want to say hearsay, it's very much like I do this and you don't and they do that. So that's exactly why we did this. We published NICS and then we got questions that said, well, does it really work? 2 years later, well, here it is. And please use this as insight for your other papers. Great. Thank you.